Tonight, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we bring wise discernment to our studies of the suttas. Some of you come here as experienced meditators and want to practice in community, in Sangha. Some of you come here because you want to get a little bit more. You've been practicing meditation a lot, but you want to find out more about the teachings and what was written of what the Buddha said. Some of you come here even though you have other spiritual traditions, because this is a place of refuge. And even though we're not meeting physically together, I hope this is still a place of refuge for you. And I want to say that, after many years of teaching and some of studying, I too decided I wanted to do a little more immersion, have a little more immersion in the actual teachings of the Buddha. And so I took one of the, 2.5 year trainings, and I'm really glad to say that East Bay Meditation Center is going to begin doing its own trainings. And I'm really happy about that because I think we have a lot of experience in bringing the teachings, the Dharma, to marginalized communities. That's part of our mission. And we both want to have a theoretical understanding of that and an understanding in practice. One thing I want to say, because I'm going to talk a little bit about what was written, is the teachings of the Buddha were written down about 600 years after his death. And we must remember that the people who wrote those teachings down tended to be monks or nuns. And they were the one that had closely associated with the Buddha. And Buddhism began as an oral tradition. You went to hear the Buddha. You listened to him. You asked questions. Many spiritual traditions are not based in the written word, although some certainly are. The Judaism, the Abrahamic religions, it said that these are peoples of the book. But in many spiritual traditions, what we start with is the passing of the teachings to the students, to the disciples. And there's always this ability to question back and forth. And after the Buddha's death, that wasn't possible. He wasn't physically present anymore. And so the people who had gathered together, who had the most freedom to study the work and to understand it, tended to be the monks, and to a certain extent the nuns. And so the written works of the Buddha, we must remember, are what was written after his death. And so I was thinking about this because when we go back to the First Noble Truth, the truth of suffering, and what is said by the Buddha, what is attributed to the Buddha, is dukkha, which the translation that I use these days is craving. When I first started studying, the term was often desire, and that has it gets conflated with other concepts in the Western world. And so I like craving. I like the term craving because it talks about an unhealthy or potentially unhealthy relation to our desires. And what is said is that sorrow, lamentation, pain, and grief and despair, all these are dukkha. Birth is dukkha, death is dukkha, association with the unbeloved, separation from the beloved, these are all dukkha. Not getting what is wanted is dukkha. And I wanted to think about it because, in the times we're living in right now, I think many of us are experiencing grief. Many of us are experiencing in this time of shelter in place, separation from our beloveds. whether those are children, grandchildren, parents. Some of us may have had the experience of having our beloveds die and not being able to be at their bedside, not being able to hold their hands or offer loving touch. Um, and I think too about the potential for the extinction of species. Um, and so I think grief is up for many of us, lamentation is up for many of us, sorrow is up for many of us. Um, there's a speech that's attributed to Chief Seattle. And again, every time that we deal with something that is in translation, something is lost. In many indigenous languages, we don't we don't have nouns. We don't say there's a woman over there, which can make woman be an object. The translation or the way that it would be said in the indigenous language is womanness is happening over there. Womaning is happening. I heard the same thing said about some of the African indigenous concepts, that the emphasis is on the active verb of beingness, and that everything is being because everything is alive and has sentience. So, in this speech that is attributed to Chief Seattle, one, we have the use of nouns. Two, because it was recorded by a man in the 1800s, the term used for humanity is man. And so we know that, you know, coming from cultures where women were honored and seen as part of the tribe, as part of the governance structure, as significant, not as the people who tore the good society apart, but as people who brought great gifts. We already know that there's a lot lost in this translation, but I still wanted to read something from it, um, even if it's not exactly historically true. I want to believe the person who wrote it down and preserved it was trying to convey to a Western audience the heart of what was meant in this speech, which is very long and extremely beautiful. And Chief Seattle says, and I'm going to use my own translations again, what is humanity without the beast? If all the beasts were gone, men would die, humanity would die from a great loneliness of spirit. For whatever happens to the beast soon happens to the human. All things are connected. You must teach your children that the ground beneath their feet is the ashes of our foreparents, so that they will respect the land. Tell your children that the earth is rich with the lives of our kin. Teach your children what we have taught our children, that the earth is our mother. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the children of the earth. If humans spit upon the ground, they spit upon themselves. And I wanted us to think for a moment. You know, we're told that we're facing the sixth great extinction. And certainly we know that it is said that the Lakota wept when they saw the slaughter of the buffalo. They wept when they saw the carcasses piled high, tongues cut off, horns cut off, but nothing of the meat taken, just taken for trophies. And they wept. We know that many of the indigenous tribes are gone. We know that the waters are being poisoned. We know that the levels of the oceans are rising. The ice is shrinking. If ever there was a time for grief or lamentation, certainly that time is now. And I wanted to say that when we look at this text with discernment and with wisdom, it is not that the Buddha is saying that we should never sorrow or we should never grieve. The Buddha recognized the pain that arises with the loss of the beloved. In the story of the woman with the mustard seed, whose child has died and who knows that the Buddha is a great spiritual teacher, so great that she believes that he can bring the dead back to life. And she carries her dead child, a child that she carried underneath her heart, the child that she carried inside her body for months, the child that she loved with all of her heart. She carries that child and she goes to the Buddha and she says, Master, please, you are a great, great teacher. Bring my child back to me. Let him walk again. Let him see again. Let his eyes look upon me with love. And it is the cry of the mother. And I want us to think about the term mother as a term of nurturing. Men can mother. Third gender beings can mother. Women can mother. Mother is not an attribute of one gender. It speaks to the capacity of our heart to lovingly care for those who come after us, those who are our children. And in many indigenous cultures, the children are all our children. We are mothers. We are kin to all the children of whatever group we belong to. So this woman comes with this great grief in her heart. And that great grief we certainly feel for the children who are in cages at the border. That great grief and sorrow we feel when this administration is separating nursing babies from their mothers. How can we not feel grief? How can we not feel sorrow? How can we not feel rage? The Buddha did not say to this woman, everything dies, just accept it. The Buddha knew that grief arises and that there is a certain cycle to the rising of it. There's a certain cycle to the rising of fear. There's a certain cycle to the arising of any feeling, any emotion. And that we see and recognize this. We acknowledge it. We recognize it. We allow it to arise. We investigate it. And finally, we do not identify with it. And that takes time. And so what the Buddha said with great compassion, he set the woman on a task. And it was a task that would allow her to come to her own acknowledgement of the fact of death. He set her on a task in which she could investigate what was happening to her, what had happening, the loss to death of her beloved. He set her on a task that would allow her to investigate whether this arose for others. And so he said very gently, and he probably called her sister, sister, go to every house in the village and bring me back a mustard seed from every house that has never known death. And the woman quickened her pace, holding her dead child in her arms, went and knocked on every house in the village. And in those times, you stayed in your house. Your children stayed with you. In America, children are supposed to leave the house, leave the home, move away. But in many cultures still today, particularly sons, stay in their natal house. And in some matriarchal cultures, in some cultures where women own the property, the house passes to the daughters. So daughters stay in the house. So in the Buddhist time, generation after generation had lived in these houses. And in every house, someone had died. There were people who had died very recently, grandparents, great grandparents. There were some, perhaps someone had died recently, someone of this woman's age, snake bite, fever, loss. And certainly, if she went to all the houses, regardless of caste, there were people who had died because of oppression, because they couldn't, their wells were not the regular wells, because they had been beaten or treated unjustly. But in every house, there was death. And it took her a while to make a circuit of the village. And she came back, and there were no mustard seeds in her hands. There is only the child and the emptiness of her heart. But in that venture in which she had gone, time had elapsed. As she came bearing this child, she would have met sometimes with women who had wept with her and shared the stories of their dead children, their miscarriages, their losses of adult children, their losses of young children. She would have wept with them. She would have been met with their compassion. As she traversed the village, she would have begun to hear stories that might have brought healing into her heart. Stories of dreams that people had. Stories of how they had coped, how they had loved, how they had maybe had other children, how they had never forgotten their losses, but that by and by, over time, there had come some heart's ease, although never was that loss ever forgotten, ever totally gone. And when she came back to the Buddha, she was readier to hear his teaching. And the teaching is that all in our life, regardless of our status, regardless of our privilege, we are subject to old age, illness, and death. And we are subject to the grief and the sorrow that arises with our loss. We are subject to the lamentation that pours out of us, the weeping that occurs when our beloved dies, the weeping that occurs when a beloved partner turns away from us, leaves. We may be thrown into depression, into grief, when someone that we have loved leaves. And if we are in the company, and this is happening as we shelter in place, that we find sometimes that we were away and suddenly we can't rejoin the society of our beloveds. We're with people who don't know us so well. We are with people who are not our beloveds, and we are angry resentful. We crave to be with those who love us, those who know us, those who are our family. And I want to say that while this all, what the Buddha, what these texts are saying is this is the ground out of which suffering arises. And that suffering to be born in the body, to love, which is natural, to crave pleasure, which is natural, that the negation of that is the first awareness that sets us on the spiritual path. And I want to say to all of us in this time when there is so much suffering and so much oppression arising, that we are called to awareness of this. We are called to awareness of the causes and conditions out of which our suffering arises. We can have anger, resentment, and hatred cause out towards our oppressors, but it does not stop the oppression from happening. What I think wise discernment causes us to do is to recognize the oppression that we are experiencing, the oppression of white supremacy, the oppression of xenophobia, hatred and fear of the other, the foreigner, the oppression of the loss of our lands, of settler colonialism, whether we're Native American, Palestinian, all of the ways, whether we are Sami people or the descendants of Sami people who are the living indigenous people of Europe, living in areas that abut on Denmark and Sweden. All of these oppressions lead to suffering. And how do we deal with them? I think we can take lessons from the indigenous people in part. I've been looking at some of the YouTube videos about the water protectors in terms of the Dakota pipeline. And that struggle was framed by indigenous people not as a protest, but as a standing for the waters, that we as humans in their traditions have a responsibility to protect the waters, that we have a responsibility to protect the animals, and that we stand with the earth, we stand with the waters, we stand against the oppression. And that is not the same thing, perhaps, as some of the more active struggles and protests. And I'm not saying that these are not struggles and protests, but they are grounded in spiritual connection. And so what I want to say is that when I read that, sorrow, grieving, lamentation, all these are craving, I don't read it as we are not to do these things. We are not to resist. We are not to feel sorrow. We are human beings. Our heart and the loss of what makes our heart joyful, to be imprisoned unfairly and unjustly. And what prison in the US is not unfair and unjust, whether you are in there falsely or wrongly convicted or not. These prisons are causes of great, great suffering. No one should be subject to prison as they are today. Our grief and our sorrow causes us to take action and causes us, as we are on a spiritual path, to take action mindfully, to take action that does not harm the people we come to help, to take action in a way that does not harm our own precious body, to step up and to step back, to not burn out, that we are called to mindfully step off of our cushion and ease the suffering of a child. That's something Thich Nhat Hanh says. We just don't sit and witness suffering. We mindfully take action to end it. We mindfully take action to ease it. We feel the sorrow of our heart as we face what is coming to be in the world. And we mindfully take action, understanding that we do not know how our actions will land. We take action mindfully, regardless of the outcome. We take action with equanimity. We take action the best way we know how, knowing that moral arc of the universe that bends towards justice, we don't always know how and why and when it will touch the ground, how it will anchor. It may not anchor on this planet, in this country, in our lifetime, but we trust that our actions will be part of that great bending of the moral arc. And whether it happens in our lifetime or not, we take joy in our ability to take action. We take joy in the transformation of our sorrow, our rage, into mindful action that helps bring into being the beloved community, the Sangha of all beings. We take mindful action. And so I want you to let's just take a couple of minutes and think about where perhaps in what I said was your heart touched. How are you feeling? What are you feeling grief or lamentation about? What deaths are you mourning? What losses have come up for you in this pandemic? And so just, again, let's feel our feet on the floor, our sits bones on the cushion or chair, our bodies lying down on the couch or the bed. And let's take a breath into our heart. What grief, sorrow, or lamentation is sitting in our heart? Who have we lost in this pandemic? What grief are we experiencing in the round of oppression that has arisen more recently for us? So again, the questions. What grief or sorrow is sitting in your heart? Who have you lost in this pandemic? what oppressions are arising in this most recent round of oppressions that we're facing as people of color. So just breathe into these questions. Just breathe into your heart, your belly, your mind, your spirit. We grieve for decades and sometimes for all of our lives. And sometimes it lessens and sometimes it comes in waves. So thank you. Thank you for that reminder of our humanity. And I think that the thing, I want to say deep apologies for anybody who felt harmed by the talk, but I'm feeling, again, the difference between intent and impact. I just think we're in such hard times, and that the relevance of these teachings from 2,500 years ago, where oppression existed, war existed, all these things that have their particular flavor right now existed. And so I want to encourage us to find a way that we make these teachings real for us. Because otherwise, what use are they? So I encourage you, whether you join us for the community, the teachings, whether you join us, just for the meditation, whether this is your style or not your style, whether you come here for refuge. Thank you for being with us tonight. Deep apologies if I have caused any harm. Deep, deep, sincere apologies for that. I know that there will be announcements, but I want to dedicate the merit. I want to dedicate the merit of tonight's practice to all those who are enduring hard times, to all those who are being born in the midst of hard times, to all those of our ancestors who experienced hard times. May those being born, may the young ones, the infants, come into and experience a time of peace. May the dreams and hopes of our ancestors for peace, freedom, liberation, and the cultivation of our gifts and talents be realized. May we serve as ancestors and midwives for the future we wish to see. Thank you. Thank you.